Welcome, everyone. We are so glad that you are joining us today. My name is Tim Chandler. I work here at Alliance Defending Freedom. Now, if you're not that familiar with our organization, ADF exists for one primary purpose. And if you ask anybody at ADF, how would you summarize that purpose in one sentence? They're all going to give you the same answer. And they're going to give you the same answer that we've had for the past 30 years since our organization was launched. And that's this: ADF exists to keep the door open for the gospel. And that's why we are particularly passionate about helping Christian schools. Because as Christian schools, you're not just educating the next generation academically, you're preparing them spiritually. You're teaching them to understand the gospel. You're teaching them to share the gospel, and you're teaching them to live out the gospel in their lives. And that, I just can't really imagine more important work that could be done. But we also know, working here at ADF, that this is an especially challenging time to be a Christian school leader. You're dealing with legal complexities and cultural challenges that make it harder and harder to just live out your mission that God's called on your organization. And so that's why we are excited to be able to be here today with you and to do this special webinar that's specifically designed to support Christian school leaders. Now, let me just run through a couple of housekeeping notes and then we'll go ahead and get started. So our goal today is simple. We want to help you take a clear-eyed look at where your school stands when it comes to key policies like admissions, hiring, athletics, and handbooks. And to do that, we've put together a school readiness questionnaire that we'll work through together during the session. And this is just a simple tool that will help you identify potential gaps in your policies and figure out what steps you should take next. You're going to see a link to the school readiness questionnaire in a box on your screen, and you can click on that and the questionnaire will open up in a new screen. And additionally, for each of the topics that we'll be covering, we'll be throwing out some real-world scenarios through interactive polls. So these polls will give you an option of answers, and those aren't defined, or they're not there to necessarily give you a definitive right answer. They're just designed to help you think. Does my school have policies that would help us respond if this particular situation comes up? And the goal is to help you think practically about how sound policies can protect your mission. So you're going to see these polls appear on your screen throughout the webinar. Please note that if you're in full screen, you may not be able to see the poll pop up. So you may want to check now and make sure that you're not in full screen mode. You can go ahead and answer the polls as they pop up, and we may talk about the results as we're going along. And those polls will remain open on your screen until you close them using the X in the upper right corner of the results box. Now, let me tell you about the folks that are sitting here at the table with me. I'm joined by three of our attorneys here at ADF who spend a lot of time working on these issues related to Christian schools. We have Pat Piccolo and Valerie Landano. They're two of our leading attorneys on our Church and Ministry Alliance team, and they routinely advise Christian schools on their governing policies that impact their schools and the way that they operate. We also have Ryan Tucker here. Ryan leads our litigation team that is dedicated to representing Christian schools and other ministries in courtrooms around the country.
I'm the guy you don't want to talk to.
Yes. We want you to work with these guys so you don't have to get to Ryan.
That's exactly right.
So we're going to talk through a bunch of issues together. We're going to share some insights and help you think through practical next steps to strengthen your school's policies. And by the end of our session, we hope that you'll have a much clearer sense of where your school stands and what you can do to protect your mission moving forward. You guys ready to dive in?
Let's
Ready.
do it.
All right. We are going to start then with admissions policies, and we'll put up our first poll question. So your admission policy at your school is often the first impression that families have of your school, but it can also be one of the more overlooked areas in terms of legal risk. So admission policies should clearly reflect your school's missions and its core values. So let's look at our poll question. This is just a hypothetical situation. So a family applies to your school, but makes it clear that they don't share your biblical beliefs. They say they respect your teachings, but they have no intention of adopting those beliefs themselves. How would your school respond? Now look through the answers there and think about this for your particular school. Give you a minute to do that. Feel free to answer the question on the poll if you'd like, but give some thought to do you know how your school would respond in this type of situation? Now, Pat, I want to kick this over to you to start us off. This is not an uncommon type of situation. How should a school think about addressing this question?
Absolutely. So, I mean, you look at the answers and you think, what's the right answer? And the truth is, it depends, which I feel like
good lawyer answer.
Yeah,
right
I feel like
there,
it's
right?
a classic lawyer cop-out answer, but it really does. And what it depends on is your answer to a prior question, which is really, what are you about? What's your mission? So when we think of schools, we think of them in two different categories, really, right? There's missional schools and there's covenantal schools. And these aren't, entirely mutually exclusive, but they're two general umbrellas to think about which one you fit under. When we're talking about a missional school, I'd say generally it means you don't require affirmation of your Christian convictions from prospective families. You're open to admitting students, children who come from families that are not Christian families. Covenantal schools, you are really seeing yourself as entering into a covenant with these families for the formation of their children. Really, the gospel or your Christian testimony is a point of solidarity between you and the family as you are working together to form their children into mature disciples. Both are great. There's not one that's necessarily better than the other. There's unique risks that come with each model, but it's important to understand which one you are. It's actually amazing to me how many schools we work with who think that they are missional or think that they are covenantal, and their documents don't actually reflect that same reality. So first you have to decide what's really our baseline with families? Is the gospel a place of solidarity with our families from which we're carrying out our educational mission? Or is your Christian testimony something that is shaping the way you're educating children, but is not necessarily something you need families to agree with you on? And I say that, however, regardless of whether you're missional or you're covenantal, it's really important to be properly communicating to prospective families about your Christian convictions, even if you're a missional school. There is no doubt that your Christian convictions are shaping your policies, they're shaping your curriculum, they're shaping your athletics, they're shaping your facility use, they're shaping any number of aspects of school life and student life. And the last thing you want is for a family to go through the admissions process, to be admitted, and then 6 months later, an issue arises with their student, and the family looks at you and says, "We had no idea. We had no idea you believed that. We had no idea that even though you believe that, you had these expectations of us." And the admissions process is really the first opportunity to communicate about who you are as a Christian school and what that means for students and families that are seeking admission. I know, Val, you probably have a lot more that you could add to that and fill in the gaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Pat, you set that up really well. And I love thinking about the admissions policies and the procedures in general. It's one of your prime opportunities, like you said, to get proactive instead of, I know, Ryan could tell you from a litigation perspective, you never want to be on your heels in litigation or in a legal conflict and, giving that other side the opportunity to say, well, I didn't know. So how can we be proactive? What are some things? And I love talking about, there's so many ideas and so many opportunities nestled within that admissions process and your policies where you can take that opportunity to clarify your beliefs, clarify your religious mission, your religious identity, and just be super clear and just be more proactive. So let me run through a list of things. We talk a lot with our members, Tim, about circuit breakers in the application process. And there's three main opportunities that we like to talk about. And like I said, lots of little pockets of opportunity within each of these three. But the three categories that we like to dig into are the information packet, which sometimes can be coupled with a school tour if you have that as part of your process. But an information packet could include an introductory letter from your headmaster, head of school. It's a great opportunity to get out in front of prospective families and explain who you are, your religious mission, how you came to be, your calling, your vision, and to be upfront about your beliefs. I think, Ryan, you would agree this is not the time to hide the ball.
Absolutely.
With prospective families. And the more clear and upfront and direct you can be, the better you're going to position yourself. So the information packet would be the first circuit breaker. The second one is your application documents themselves. So most schools have some sort of an application process. You fill out all the biographical information, family information, but don't miss the opportunity to ask good questions to vet these prospective families for their alignment and their fit with your religious mission, with your identity, with your beliefs. And like Pat said, I think essentially there tends to be two types of schools, two categories of schools, covenantal or missional. But in either category, there's going to be a component of questions that should be important to you as you're vetting the types of students, the types of families that you desire to align with in your school environment as you're building your school community. So be upfront. There's plenty of opportunities in the application form and then in the enrollment documents as well. So 2 sets of documents in that category. And the third circuit breaker that we recommend as a best practice is the interview, a personal interview. So if you're not already taking advantage of that opportunity, I think it's a great way to complete that vetting process. And I keep looking at Ryan because I know he would agree from a litigation standpoint. This is one of those categories where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So
There's a lot of unforced errors that we hear on a daily basis, calls that come in. So absolutely.
Exactly. So the more you take advantage of those opportunities in your process, you build into those circuit breakers. A circuit breaker essentially is designed to stop the application process or stop the admissions process before you're letting a problem in the front door, right? It's easier to vet on the front end than to address an unnecessary problem on the back end.
And what I love about this is, Pat, you started off and said, there's lots of different types of schools. There's different approaches. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Different schools have different missions, and they can serve different audiences in that way. And we see that even in our poll results that there's different schools are going to handle the situation differently, and that's okay. And we want to come alongside all of those schools and work with them based on the calling that God has put on their particular institution. That being said, there are some really important best practices that apply across the board. I think Val, you did a good job explaining that. Ryan, when that doesn't happen, and there are legal risks or legal problems that come up, or schools don't have clear policies, or they're not enforcing them consistently, what kind of stuff are you seeing?
It can be a big problem in the courtroom. I mean, clarity, consistency are necessary guideposts. When we go to the courtroom, I want to be able to explain to the court very clearly what the school's position is, because if the school doesn't know what their position is, then how in the world does a secular judge, often, a non-believer, know, where you stand on certain things? So clarity is key. I'll give you just one brief example. It's in the employment context, but it still relates here as well. I was litigating a case in the Ninth Circuit just a few months ago, and the other side kept pointing to a particular case. And in that case, it was a Christian school, California, and they had an employment health benefits related issue that they were dealing with. And in their own internal documentation, they said X in one portion of the document, and they said Y in the other. As you might imagine, that lack of clarity caused a lot of confusion, a lot more difficult conversations, which eventually led to litigation. And guess what? That case is still being cited against us in some other cases. So it's real important to really adhere to the clarity and consistency that these two just talked about. And again, just so many of these errors can be fixed now. And it's better to tackle them now as opposed to talking to me on the back end when you're in the courtroom.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although you're in good hands with Ryan.
Yes,
if you have to go there, there's
absolutely
nobody better.
We've got a team of lawyers that can assist. And look, nobody's perfect. We're human. We get it. And I think even in that instance, I think the court decided it wrong. But it's a lot easier when you go in with good facts, consistently drafted and also implemented, because that's another key that we may talk about here in a bit.
Absolutely. Well, let's invite everybody. If you want to take a minute and pull up that school readiness questionnaire, there's a link to there in your box. There's the first 3 questions. The first section of that questionnaire deals with this particular issue. And we'd invite you to just open that up, take a look at it, read through those questions. You can even take notes in the document if you want. But allow those questions to sort of prompt thinking is where are there areas in our school where we may not have the clarity that we need, or maybe we're not enforcing this as consistently as we should. And we don't want to end up in that situation where we have to explain inconsistencies to a judge or whatever. You can avoid so many of these problems by making sure that those things are locked in real tight. And so this is an opportunity to just give you a minute to think through those, maybe note some things down that you have more questions about or would want to talk to an attorney about further about how your school is handling the situation. So feel free to open that up, look at those, and take a couple notes. And with that, we'll move on to our next topic, because we touched on employment already, and I think that's a great area for us to go into more and talk about schools' hiring policies. And we'll do another poll question on this. So because hiring policies, as we all know, and as I'm sure you would know as well, they're one of the most important ways that schools can protect their mission. Who you have working in your school will dramatically impact the way that you're interacting with the families and the students and the messages that you're communicating to them, and the spiritual formation of the students as well. So, and this is also, as you can imagine, one of the areas where schools, I think, get into the most legal trouble. So if we look at our poll question, this is, again, just another hypothetical, but and it says, a teacher applies for a position at your school. During the interview, the applicant shares that they are living in a way that conflicts with your statement of faith. You are worried that not hiring them in this situation may be considered discrimination and may result in a lawsuit. How would your school respond? So there's 3 different options there. You can look at that and think through what your response would be. In a lot of ways, right, the best answer to this may be join the Church and Ministry Alliance here at ADF. Because as a member, when these types of situations arise, which they inevitably do for a Christian school, you have access to an ADF attorney. You can talk to Val, or you can talk to Pat, and they can help guide you on how to respond before you even get very far down into this situation. So, Pat, let's start with you. Just talk a little bit about how you help our Church and Ministry Alliance members walk through this type of situation and think it through.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is a really, as you said, Tim, personnel is so, what's that saying? Personnel is policy.
Yeah.
You know, and especially at a school, you see your employees as like a living curriculum. Sometimes they're embodying what you're trying to lead students forth into. So it's so important. The first thing that I'm going to do if a member calls me is, one, I'm going to be really grateful that they called as the situation arose. And then secondly, I'm going to ask a lot of questions. I think we're going to want to fill in a lot of gaps. Sometimes these situations can have nuance and idiosyncrasies that you have to account for. You guys could probably fill in some of the questions I'll miss, but what's the job they're applying for? What are the responsibilities associated with that job? Do you have other applicants that you're looking at? Have you already asked questions about this applicant's religious convictions? Do you typically require all of your employees to be aligned with your Christian convictions? What's the next step in the hiring process? How do you typically communicate with prospective applicants who aren't a good fit for whatever reason? Are there other reasons this applicant is not a good fit for this position? We're going to want to gather all of that information. We're going to want to see their application. We're going to want to see the job description. We will want to know what happened in the conversation. What exactly did the applicant say? How did you respond to the applicant in real time? And have you had situations like this in the past? We're going to try to gather all that information and then think of the most tactful and appropriate way to respond to this situation in a way that's also preserving your Christian witness and is being authentic to who the school is and how the school wants to communicate with applicants generally.
Yeah, that's great. Now, Ryan, you touched a bit already on how these issues pop up in the courtroom, and they can create issues. But there's more cases than the one you described, right? You want to talk a little bit more about that?
There's a ton. I mean, recently, just in the last few years, we've had, great strides in this particular space. You've got the Our Lady of Guadalupe decision. There's a lot of legal protection for religious schools, and so we're very thankful for that. There's a lot of legal protection, related to the hiring of school teachers and those sorts of things. There are, open, broader questions though on other staff, within the organization. There are a couple cases I think that help illustrate the point. We're dealing, and for my friends that are in Michigan and Washington, you really need to be paying attention here because those are two states that have got some very serious issues in state law. And so just a brief overview there. In both states, you've got a non-discrimination law that's in place that really, its goal, frankly, is to restrict the rights of these institutions to hire, fire, discipline, to hire like-minded people. And so, for example, in Michigan, the state recently reinterpreted its state non-discrimination law to require a particular school, Sacred Heart, wonderful institution in Grand Rapids, to require them to not only they're putting them to a choice, either change your religious hiring practices and even how you handle even private spaces, or run the risk of possible discrimination complaints being filed. And recognizing the unconstitutionality of that law, we have challenged that. There's also there's more than one challenge there, and we're still litigating that matter. So there's still open questions there. I feel quite confident in our ability to successfully challenge that law. But the same thing's going on in Washington. It involves a religious rescue mission in that instance. And while it's not a K through 12 school, it will have a tremendous impact on the religious schools in that state. Frankly, I think it eventually could have a tremendous impact on schools nationwide. It's the Union Gospel Mission of Yakima case, so I highly encourage you to get on our website at ADF Legal and check it out. But there, the state, again, is trying to force a religious organization to change its hiring policies, in particular relative to positions that the courts don't deem to be quote-unquote ministerial in nature. That would be a whole nother webinar to get into that. But bottom line is, it's sort of commonsensical, and it has not been an issue until relatively recently, that religious institutions should have the right to hire folks that are in a line with their doctrinal tenets. That's sort of common sense. And for the most part, throughout most of the states, that still remains true. But at least in a couple instances, there are questions that have arisen. And because of that, we're litigating those cases. And I think at some point, hopefully in the near future, we're going to see one of those cases get to the U.S. Supreme Court. So it's a very important field, and one that ADF's very much interested in pursuing.
Yeah, and we're glad for that. But I think one of the big takeaways from that is this is a ever-changing area. There's a lot of uncertainty. And I know for you guys, Val and Pat, you guys are always getting calls from schools with questions about their hiring policies. So tell us, in your experience with doing that, what are some of the common mistakes that you see that schools have in their policies?
Sure. Yeah, I'll take that one. I think, they always say the benefit of hindsight is it's 2020, right? So this is an example where we can collect a lot of helpful data points from the thousands of members in our program that do reach out to us. And we can, unpack some best practices based on some gaps and some holes and some things that we regularly see. So with schools in particular, one of the core documents we're always looking at, and Ryan can appreciate from a litigation perspective why we're looking at this document closely, is the job descriptions. And so within the job descriptions, some things that we commonly see is a lack of clarity about the tie of the particular role to the religious mission of the school. And also, it's not uncommon that we find that the job description fails to describe the spiritual and religious aspects of the job as clearly as it could. I think what Pat, you would agree. I see you shaking your head. When we talk to schools, we always kind of lead the conversation along. What are some things you would naturally expect of your teachers, of your custodial staff, of your administrative staff? Would you expect them to be able to stop and pray with a student that's distressed in the hallway? Would you expect them to be able to deliver a gospel presentation at a moment's notice? These are the types of organic opportunities that come up in the cafeteria sometimes, but those expectations sometimes are invisible and they're not always noted on the job description.
I just want to double down on that. From a litigation perspective, I mentioned the Our Lady case, and there's countless other examples in recent years where federal courts, including U.S. Supreme Court justices, have gone to the trouble of actually citing, whether it's a job description or a policy or bylaws. And so I can tell you, if it's important for a U.S. Supreme Court justice to take the time to include that in your decision, well, rest assured, I think it's important for you to take this very seriously as well. Absolutely, it'll help me, selfishly on the back end with litigation, but I just want to emphasize that point.
Oh, thank you. No, I think so. The job descriptions, I started there because I think to Ryan's point, that's an often overlooked document, but it's all of the core documents, governing documents. We look holistically at all of those when we're working with a school member. We actually have a recent tool we rolled out called the Religious Liberty Assessment that helps us to work with schools in a very structured way. Start with the bylaws, start with the articles, work our way out to the policies, the handbooks. But I didn't want to skip job descriptions because, especially in the school space, those hold some critical importance, and the words matter on the page. And so a lot of the work we're doing with members, Tim, is just helping them bring to surface and clarify on paper what's already their practice. And so that's all. It's not hard work, but you just need to be intentional and diligent and disciplined on the front end about it. So a couple other things on the job descriptions before I leave that category include the qualifications for the role. So it's another easy one to miss, the simple expectation that if you expect, Ryan, that your employees are going to share your Christian faith or a certain set of beliefs or a denominational affiliation, perhaps, that should be clarified and written down on the job description. Don't leave that for assumption. Some other common mistakes that we see, or gaps and holes that we try to help fill, are neglecting to require a signed affirmation of the school's statement of beliefs. Ideally, as a best practice, this would be an annual practice. You can fold it into your annual signing documents. So that's a simple thing. But similarly, I find more often that schools neglect to have a process in place to follow up organically on the things that hopefully they're clarifying in the job description about their religious expectations. So let me walk out an example. If you, as a school, require your teachers and all of your staff, for that matter, to attend church as often as possible every Sunday, a particular church or a non-denominational, it doesn't matter. But if that's one of your expectations, or you expect them to engage in personal devotions and read their Bible and pray with students, all these things that we're talking about, sometimes the invisible expectations, what are you doing to follow up on those? And that's what we really encourage our members to think about doing. It's just not just talking the talk, but walking the walk too. And it's totally appropriate and recommended to have an annual or regular review process to check in on the spiritual life and health of your staff from top to bottom, truly, and ask those questions. You could do it in the form of a survey that you collect once a year about, how often are you attending church? How, what are you learning in your personal devotional life? Are you discipling students? Give us some stories. Are you engaged in local ministry? Those are all good practices that you can incorporate if you're not already doing so. And, I think some benefits of getting proactive in this space, Tim, is that you'll never be able to measure how many unnecessary headaches that you've spared yourself on the back end by doing that good work on the front end. So you can help yourself here.
That was the point Pat was just making. He was talking about, look, there's a series of questions we're going to be asking, and on the litigation side, we're going to be asking the same thing. So definitely applaud, the importance of the code of conduct, signing off. I mean, so many of these situations don't have to come to me through clarity and just being upfront with who you are. Don't hide who you are. So many religious schools come to us and say, well, I'm in a blue state. I was concerned that, I might put a target on my back. I'm like, listen, you've got a target on your back already, if you didn't know that. But, I often say, and people can debate me, but the more religious you are, the better your religious liberty protections are. So when you're hiding the ball, it creates confusion amongst the body. There's no clarity, and it often results in a phone call with me. So avoid that and just be clear. And like Val said, make sure that you're following up. It's good not just for administrative purposes, but even just being brothers and sisters in Christ. I think it's an important thing to do. We're called to sharpen one another.
If I could just echo a couple of those points, I think one thing I often find myself telling schools or ministries that I work with is be honest.
Exactly.
Let your documents accurately reflect who you are. Let this be one-to-one with reality. If you have expectations of people, put those down on paper. And then to echo what you guys were just saying on the other point, these are not just good legal practices. They're actually just healthy rhythms for any religious community. To check in with one another, to be returning to the touchstones of, hey, we are a Christian community and we have solidarity around these convictions about who God is, who Jesus is, and who he calls us to be. Those are healthy things that actually prevent mission drift, as well as offer the sort of legal protection
Absolutely.
in the event of a dispute.
Yeah, love that.
Amen.
I love that what's good for people is also a good legal practice. It's great when it works out that way. So I want to touch on one other thing before we move on to the next topic, because, and this can come up with all of these issues, but I think this is one where it comes up a lot. And because we tend to focus a lot on the legal issues that come up, but sometimes the toughest thing that schools deal with when these issues arise is not legal. It's more kind of what's going on in the public square. It's the media. It's the way that, somebody may be making accusations against the school and they're doing it on social media or they're doing it through the press. And it can, when you're doing, dealing with sound bites and that whole thing, it can get ugly and difficult. And I think we often talk to schools that's what the biggest challenge for them is. And they don't really know how to handle that, or they may not know that that's something that we can potentially help with too. So Ryan, you want to talk about that?
Yeah. The court of public opinion is oftentimes, even more important perhaps than the courts. And the reason I say that is, religious schools have great religious liberty protections in place. I mean, we're thankful for that. There's obviously open questions that we talked about before, but oftentimes when a school calls, it's not that I find particular concern that, oh my goodness, they're going to end up in the courthouse and we either need to defend it or help them in some way. It's more, how do they deal with the crisis of a communication media issue? I think Pat alluded to it earlier, the importance of talking either to us. I've even seen some schools that have had, even parents or even staff that have been in positions that can help them navigate media inquiries and that sort of thing. So I would say if there's an issue that you're on solid legal footing, but it looks like, tomorrow there's going to be a hit piece in the newspaper, you need to take that seriously. Now, you need to seek wise counsel on that. Maybe that's through us, maybe that's through somebody local. If you're in a pinch and you're moments away and there's no time to even pick up the call, there's probably a few practice pointers that I could briefly mention. I think one is resist the temptation to write a treatise to try to defend yourself, because listen, we live in a world that's in 7-second sound bites. And sometimes when I ask schools, well, what's your position here? This happened. What do you have to say in response? Like, what do you think? And well, Ryan, we're glad you mentioned that. I actually have this 2-pager that we're going to send out to our staff, to our, all of our employees, to our students, to the local media that asked. I'm like, oh, wait a second. Are they going to read this whole thing? Resist the temptation to write a War and Peace novel. Most sane, and I think most people are still there, they'll understand the fact that a religious institution, well, go figure, they hired like-minded individuals. So I think sometimes boiling it down to the obvious and providing clarity there is important. The other thing too, obviously in this context and why it's also important to seek counsel, there might be privacy concerns associated with it. You won't necessarily be talking about a situation that very likely may end up in court, or if you happen to say the wrong thing, maybe they don't get you for the necessarily the employment dispute, but maybe you say something now is quote unquote defamatory in nature, or you step on a mine that otherwise wasn't there. So obviously take it seriously, don't slough it off. But there's ways for either us or another like-minded individual can walk you through this. You don't have to do this alone, which I think is one of the main points of this whole webinar.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I think it's really helpful. So I want to give you the opportunity now, if you want to pull back up their school readiness questionnaire, there's 4 questions in there dealing with this topic. Now that we've sort of touched on some of the issues, that gives you a chance to just sort of walk through some guided questions and think about your own policies and where you might have questions or uncertainty and things that you might want to ask an attorney about. So feel free to do that as you like. But I want to turn to our next topic, which is a big one. It's kind of a hot topic right now. We can put up our next poll question, but we're going to talk about sports and athletic policies, because that has become a major cultural and legal battle for Christian schools as they work to uphold their biblical values when in deciding how they want to engage in sports. And as much as I know, would all love to think that the recent executive order has just solved this issue and made it go away, it hasn't. This is still an issue that schools have to deal with. So let's talk about our poll question, which again is just a hypothetical to get us thinking. So your athletic conference allows male athletes who identify as female to compete on girls' teams. How would your school respond? Very simple, but again, it's the issue that we're seeing pop up over and over again. Several different options there. Look through those, think through those. Do you have a clear answer for your school? Do you know what it is? Go ahead and answer that there in the poll if you want. And Ryan, let's let you kick off the discussion here, because we know there's not one surefire right answer to this. We see a lot, but we see a lot of different schools dealing with it. Just give us some examples of some of the schools that you're working with and how they're handling this situation.
Yeah. Well, first off, I would say this is a tremendous threat to religious schools. I mean, I think that's partly why, we have so many people interested in this topic. They recognize the fact that if a state-sponsored sports league can kick them out of their particular athletic association, that's going to have a tremendous impact on the school itself and possibly even, retainment of students. Because let's face it, I've got 4 kids, and sports is of varying importance to those, even in my own household. But on the whole, you want to be able to provide the very best. And if you want to play ball in the very best conference, oftentimes that means for some of these schools, not all, but some of them, that they're going to be competing in the state-sponsored or best sports league, so to speak. And so right now, we are currently representing Mid-Vermont Christian School, great institution in Vermont, who was faced with really just a Hobson's choice, an impossible choice. They learned right before their girls' varsity basketball playoffs that they were going to be paired against a team who had a male on the other side, pretending to be a female. And they debated it. They reached out, to have further conversation. All that was rebuffed. So what ended up happening was they made the decision that they were going to forfeit that game. And in response to that, the state didn't say, okay, well, that was a playoff game. Your punishment is your girls don't get to play anymore. To me, that's punishment enough. I mean, they never should have been in that position to begin with. No, they tripled down on that. They said, not only are you going to be kicked out of your league, not only the girls going to be, their season is done, but all the school in its entirety will be kicked out of the league in perpetuity. So we got involved in that. We filed a lawsuit. We're currently at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, where we're waiting for the court to set that for oral argument. And that case is going to have an impact, certainly in our friends in the Northeast. But that case and other matters like it, including there's another situation in California recently. Stone Ridge Christian, faced with a very similar situation, had a girls' varsity volleyball game, and they were paired against another team that had a male, and they too made the decision to forfeit. And right now we're waiting for the California Sports League, the CIF. And for my friends in California and in some of these other blue states, you've seen in local press. I mean, even yesterday, the Attorney General sent a letter to California, to Minnesota. There's another blue state involved, basically saying, listen, President Trump has made clear that for state associations that are comprised, at least in part, of schools that are, say, subject to Title IX, they receive federal dollars. If you are allowing males to compete against females, then we're gonna pull the plug on funding. We're gonna investigate you, those sorts of things. And those, so far, those blue states are thumbing their nose at the administration. So that's why it's important. The executive order was a great step in the right direction. And ADF's been litigating this issue, at least in the Title IX space and for a federal funding side, for years now. This is one of the things that we were involved in at the get-go. And in fact, we've got 2 cases now pending at the United States Supreme Court. But this is a matter that is not going away. And Tim, you asked me, how do they approach this? Some people, even within ADF, I think the natural question is, well, Ryan, is this really a religious issue? I'm like, well, okay. Stop and think about it. I'll tell you about my conversation with these, institutions, not giving away privilege issues. This is all a matter of public record. They've testified to this in documentation. They say, look, if you show up to a basketball game or a volleyball game, and let's say you're a neutral observer, and you see it's a girls' varsity whatever game, and you see the other side as a male on the other side, what kind of message are you sending? You're sending a message to your own constituency, to your own students, that sex is changeable. You're buying into this lie. Genesis answers the question, and what kind of message are you sending, let alone the fact that in many of these states, in order for you to maintain your membership there, you're going to have to change. What if some gender confused kid, struggling? We all struggle with multiple things. Let's say there's a kid that just happens to be in your institution, comes to you and says, I want to play on the opposite sex sports team. Well, under a lot of these guidelines that are currently out there, if you don't allow that to happen, well, guess what? You can get kicked out of that league potentially as well. And so a lot of these schools, they're not asking for much. All they're asking for is, listen, if we see an opportunity or we see a situation that we can't, based on our own beliefs, compete, be a part of, we want the opportunity to not have to play that game. Just like there's a lot of stuff going around, sickness and that sort of thing. If another team shows up, whether it's COVID or whatever, and they decide to forfeit, if you can forfeit for a secular reason and face no prohibition as a result of that, then why in the world, when you put forth a religious reason or any reason at all, why can't you have the same accommodation? Instead, they're trying to punish them. So it's an important area for ADF right now.
Well, and Pat, I want you to pick it up from here. And I would just say I love talking to you about this issue because I know it's something that you care about, you thought deeply about, and I think you've really captured in your mind sort of the tension I think Ryan's identified, which is we're dealing with truth. And this is an important issue. Schools want to uphold their mission, stand on the truth, but they have to make tough decisions to do that, and regarding their conferences and being able to participate, but also the way that they treat individual students that are struggling with these things. So how it can feel overwhelming, right? And so how do you help school leaders think through this issue ahead of time before they're actually confronted with it so they can be prepared to handle it the best way they possibly can?
I love this topic. And the only person who I've met who might like talking about it more is Ryan Tucker. I wish that this discussion wasn't prompted by the problems that we're seeing. I wish that it wasn't such an existential threat, as Ryan has sometimes called it, for Christian schools. And I wish it wasn't prompted by bad ideas and, honestly, broken hearts in children. I wish that wasn't reality. However, I think this is a tremendous opportunity for Christian schools to bear witness. I see this as a really tremendous opportunity to bear witness, not only about biological reality that's ordained by God, but about the human person generally, about formational processes in education, and about athletics. So honestly, when I have a conversation with a school about this, this is a bit maybe of a theme for me, but I think you have to take a step back and ask a prior question first, which is, why do you have athletics at all? I think we need to unearth some assumptions that we have or things we've taken for granted for hundreds of years and really articulate them. Sometimes we talk about sports as extracurricular. Are they really, though? They're really more co-curricular.
Exactly.
Right? Sports are actually a place that we don't just have sports in schools because we think, we want Johnny to be able to get a scholarship, or it's good for exercising, or get some energy out at the end of the day. There's a real formational and educational purpose to athletics. And I think beginning there with something we've taken for granted, that schools have sports, and saying, why though? Why is a Christian school? How does this fold into our mission as a Christian school? How does this fit into our program? I think there is a superabundance of concepts there that Christian schools have had for a long time. The idea that a sporting contest is almost like a microcosm of the life of a disciple, right? You encounter the life of a disciple in miniature in a sporting contest. Adversity, the need for virtue. As St. Paul says to Timothy, only the one who competes according to the rules gets the crown. That sports are a place where we learn the importance of these things, form deep sororal and fraternal bonds. And quite frankly, for a school, as you were alluding to, Ryan, that athletic competition is also an opportunity for bearing witness to the greater public. Is putting on display the fruit of your educational work. as you see it play out in this physical contest. It's an incredibly important part of a formational mission. So we start there with kind of just a philosophical discussion, and then we funnel down into, okay, well then why do you have single-sex competition? How does single-sex competition uniquely advance those purposes of your athletics program? I think there's a lot we could say, but just to throw a couple out there, that one of the reasons we split up between men and women, we talk a lot about fairness and safety, right? Well, what we're actually doing is acknowledging and recognizing God's creativity in designing two different types of bodies for the human person. And in a sporting event, we're hoping to glorify God's creation of that particular creative choice that he made, right? And when you have a male athlete, the male body emerges a victor in a female competition, you've thwarted one of the very purposes, one of the very religious purposes of glorifying God's creation of the female body and its capabilities. That purpose has been obliterated by allowing for this other individual to participate in the competition. If your conference has changed the rules, we talked about rules earlier, one of the things that a school might see itself as doing in its stewardship responsibilities for students is teaching the importance of rules and playing by the rules. You can't cheat. You can't bend the rules. You have to compete according to them if you want to get the crown. And a school might feel like it's failing in its stewardship mission to its students by telling its students, well, some rules we can bend. Some rules, when in certain circumstances, they don't matter. A school might consider this a failure of its educational purposes in athletics if it has to either acknowledge the legitimacy of a rule that directly contradicts its religious convictions, and it might see that as failing in the word it speaks to its students, its student athletes in that same context. And then the last piece is, as Ryan was pointing out earlier, when you have that contest, there is something implicit that a school could arguably be conceding or feel that it's conceding, believe it's conceding in competing in that competition in a public way by saying we acknowledge the legitimacy of this contest when the school, based on its core convictions, really doesn't. And so we kind of talk through that, and then we think, let's unearth these ideas, let's think deeply about it, let's pray about it. What is the purpose? What's glorifying to God? And now let's write it down. Let's articulate it and put it into a policy.
And on that point, it may be, Pat, I'm interested to get your thoughts. I'll pretend to be Tim for a second here, if Tim's okay with that.
It seems like an improvement in my.
No, not at all. Not at all. You don't want the litigator over here talking, but I do want to pick your brain, if you will, on whether or not this is something that you consider like a standalone. Like, I need to develop this, you mentioned policies. Is this like a standalone thing, or is this something that's broader and sort of woven throughout? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's woven throughout in that I'm going to say a little bit of both, and I'll clarify what I mean. So I do think there's an element to which it's woven throughout, and that you don't want your convictions about the human person appearing for the first time in your athletics policy, right? You want those beliefs to have been deeply grounded in the core convictions of the school. However, I do think it's helpful to have an athletics policy that's specifically addressing the questions we're talking about.
Yeah.
Why do we have athletics? And not that the athletics policy is all about this issue.
Right.
You're going to talk about a lot of things in athletics policy. Student grades, practices, the importance of all the, the coach's responsibilities, what we owe to our teammates, sportsmanship, all of these things are going to be in your athletics policy, what you expect of your athletes. Part of that, I think, should be addressing, hey, we have single-sex competitions, and here is how we see that being implemented at this school and how we see it advancing the purposes of our athletics program generally.
Yeah.
And you ground it there. So it's rooted in the heart of the school, its core convictions, but it's finding unique expression in this particular context in a way that is, I think, compellingly showing the ethos of athletics and a really deep and prayerful discernment. So it's not just, we didn't want to play in this competition,
Exactly.
but we actually have thought deeply about why we're doing this. I think that's compelling and a great witness to the world.
Tim, could I jump real quick to add one point?
Absolutely.
I can't not weigh in on the athletics discussion too. As a former female athlete, I come from a family of soccer players, and I played competitively as a teen up for the Olympic development team for my state. I live in a house with three boys and a husband. So there's constantly, football, baseball, basketball, you name it. If it's a ball, it's flying around the house. We're at the fields all the time. But I just want to note too how this issue, I think it deeply resonates with parents. And so it's really important. I love to hear Pat talk and think about it deeply from a school leader perspective. But I just want to note too, I was speaking at a conference last week to an audience of college leaders at Christian colleges, and there was just a dad from the audience that came up to me afterwards, and he said, I want to thank you and thank ADF for your work, all these years, like Ryan mentioned, on the women's sports and the fairness issue, because he has a daughter that plays sports, like I did. And it's common sense that there's differences inherent to males and females. And I think to Pat's point, it ties to a Genesis 1 theology, and that's where we can do the good work in the documents. But keep in mind that it matters to your parents and to your community too. And then the second point I wanted to make is, Ryan, back to your Vermont case for just a moment, because I was talking with audiences last week about the Vermont case. And one element of that case that you didn't mention, but it's deeply troubling to me, is that not only was that school kicked out of the athletic programs, but also statewide, and correct me, if I say this wrong, but the spelling bee and the other non-athletic competitions too. So there's even more at stake sometimes.
Yeah. The judge forced them to allow us back into the academic competitions, but the Vermont Principals Association runs both an athletic side and, as Valerie mentioned, a academic side as well. So spelling bees, like geography, quiz bowls, those sorts of things, they punished them there too and said, no, you can't even participate in that. So a lot of these states are being very vindictive in this space. And the judge, didn't obviously grant us the relief we wanted in the sports space. The judge did look at them sort of like commonsensically, like, really? Are you going to do this? And has allowed them. And fortunately, I know Mid-Vermont will have an opportunity to participate in that, but it just shows you how important the subject is. And, one thing too, Tim, I know that we're maybe kind of running long, but I know a lot of the people here have joined to hear this discussion. I think this is a great first step for being prepared, but that's not enough. I mean, really, if you think about sort of what's on your to-do list, what's on your bullet points, you need to have a conversation yesterday about what you're going to do when this faces you. Because as much as I'd like to say that, these religious schools are sort of in a cocoon-like state where they're not going to get this, you are. It's just a matter of when. And so you need to, as Pat and Valerie have talked about, and this is a theme that resonates throughout, you need to plan ahead. You don't want to wait for the phone call where the 22-year-old coach calls you and says, by the way, the horn just blew. We've got to take the court. What do you want us to do? That's a bad time to have that conversation and make a decision on the fly. Now is the time to have that conversation. So what I mean by that, it may look differently for different schools. I think you get your coaches aside, your board, or whoever the players are, if you will, in that space, and you develop what are we going to do? Do you have to document it all down in writing? Not necessarily. In fact, I think you want to be careful if you choose to do something like that, and you would want to seek counsel on that. But you at least need to know, how are we going to handle this? That's the way Mid-Vermont and that's the way, Stone Ridge handled it, but how are you going to handle it? So develop a plan, and that plan should include not just what are we going to do as far as are we going to play the game, but if we know in advance, listen, a lot of this stuff you hear about. Like, you're going to see news stories. Coaches talk. You know who your next competitor is going to be. You know this is coming. You may know that in another sport here in the spring, the opposite sex and player is going to be there. Now's the time to have that conversation. Don't wait. So develop that plan. Think about too, what's going to be the media fallout here. I referenced briefly what that might look like, but we need to develop a plan and what that looks like as well. And then, prepare for the possibility of, are we going to take a stand like these other schools have taken? Are we going to use some statewide association of schools that maybe can help drive some of these issues? You need to think through these things in advance. And at the end of the day, ask us. I mean, we've talked a lot on this topic, and as we've all talked about, we're pretty passionate about this subject matter. ADF's been in the front lines on this for years now. And I don't see it going away. I wish it would tomorrow. I don't see that. I think it's going to have to work its way through the courts. And so that's what we're seeing. And so if you have a situation, if you know of a particular opponent or matter that's going to come, I implore you to call us and let us walk you through some of these issues.
Yeah, and I'm just going to wrap up with one point on that, because one of the things I think we hear a lot is, well, can you just send me a template policy or, a model policy? Just tell us what we should put in our policy. And, people always ask, why don't we just do that? And I love this discussion because it really shows why that's so insufficient. Being able to sit down and have a conversation and really think through not just what your policy should be, but what are your core convictions on these issues, and then how do our policies reflect those core convictions? It's just so inadequate to try to just copy somebody else's, but to be able to have access to attorneys that have thought about it at this level of depth, and to talk to Pat, talked about Ryan about, what are your convictions and how do you think those through and how do you tailor something that's specific to your situation? It's so much more valuable. And that's why we don't send out a lot of just templates and sort of, one size fits all things for every single school. We want you to sit and have these conversations and think through them for yourselves. And you're going to be better off for it. Your families and students are going to be better off for it. And so I just think this is a really good example of why that matters. So lots to think about there. Pull up your questionnaire if you want. There's a couple of prompts, 3 different ones there for you to look at and say, what are our core values, core convictions on this, and do our policies reflect that? Give you an opportunity to maybe note some things that you have questions about or you want to dig a little deeper on to be thinking about down the road. But let's turn to one more topic. We're going to talk about parent and student handbooks. We have a poll question on that topic, but these handbooks, they're important, right? They're really important. They set expectations for families and students, and provides the framework for dealing with behavioral issues. And we know for those types of issues, it's just a matter of when, it's not if, they're going to rise. So our poll question is this: a student at your school posts inappropriate content on social media. Now that's hard for me to imagine that could ever happen, but let's just bear with me here. A student at your school posts inappropriate content on social media that directly conflicts with your biblical values. The parents claim the school has no right to discipline their child for something done outside of school hours. How would your school respond? So give everybody a second to just look through those 4 options and think through, do you know? Because if you're not sure, that can be telling in of itself. And that's a good sign of, well, maybe we need to make sure we know with absolute clarity how we're going to handle these types of situations. So I'll give you a second to think through that. And Val, I'm going to have you kick us off on this topic. What, in your mind, makes for a strong parent and student handbook? What should be included there?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, the answer helps absorb some of these hypotheticals. We drafted these poll questions based on real life calls that Pat and I and our colleagues get on our CMA team regularly. And it's always better, to Ryan's point, even on the sports issues, same concept here. As much as you can't anticipate all scenarios and all hypotheticals, but we encourage our members to try to think them through in advance and then design your handbook in a way that it can hopefully address and accommodate these different situations, including off-campus use, off-campus activity, and social media, of course, a huge issue for today's generation. Staff as well, not just the students. I should add that point. So as with the admissions policy we were talking about earlier, and as with the employment documents we were talking about earlier, same concepts are at play here, Tim. Clarity, you have this opportunity to get out front, to get ahead, to establish. I really think Pat and I have talked about this sometimes, that we think in your documents, you actually have a beautiful evangelistic type of an opportunity to articulate the gospel and paint the picture in a way of God's good design for human flourishing, to paint the picture of that Genesis 1, God creates males and females immutably. This is part of his design, part of his care. It's a reflection of him. So when I think about a student handbook, I prefer to see them not just rattling off a list of don't do this, don't do this, don't do that, and a list of the things that we're against. Of course, some of that is practical and important, especially in the gray zone areas where it might not be crystal clear. And social media and off-campus statements falls in that category, of course. But, you know, also you have this opportunity to sing the song sweetly, is a phrase we use at ADF sometimes, and to paint the picture of your biblical framework for your beliefs and explain why, connect the dots for the parents, for the students, and for your employee handbooks, same concept again of, you know, because this is how we see the Bible, because this is our lens, this is how we're going to apply our conduct standards. And a code, I like to call it a code of Christian conduct too, and that you have that liberty, you have that legal freedom as a religious organization, as a Christian school, to be upfront, to be direct about your beliefs, and to let your beliefs dictate your boundaries and your parameters for student behavior and conduct and discipline standards. And for example, if you wish to enact a Matthew 18 type of policy to work out differences and disputes within your school community, the handbook is a really important place to spell out those steps. So lots of opportunities to be upfront. Don't hide the ball. Play off our sports analogies here a little further, and we have some different language and templates that, you know, we use with our members as we're helping review their handbooks.
Great. Ryan, I know one of the tough issues in this in particular is off-campus behavior. What advice do you have for schools for dealing with problematic off-campus?
Well, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head earlier. You mentioned, you know, in some of these situations, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. I think that's certainly the case here. You know, there's a lot of issues here that come into play. You know, first off, are your policies clear? Do they even include the action or the problem that has arisen? So do you have clarity in what your own policies say? You know, what specifically was it that took place? What kind of impact that has on the student, him or herself, or even the student body, the community, the school itself? And so there's a lot of questions that would arise if you were to inquire with us as to, you know, sort of the next steps. But I think at the end of the day, as Valerie just alluded to, I think a well-crafted handbook can alleviate, possibly, you know, eliminate the prospect that you end up in the courthouse over something like this. And again, it not to beat a dead horse here. You know, this is why it's just so important when you know, and you can't, you know, you can't delineate every possible situation, but you need to at least express what your position is in a general sense on these activities that fall outside sort of the normal, you know, 9 to 3 school bell. So, you know, clarity is key, and you know, every situation is no doubt going to be different.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to start wrapping things up now. But if as we're doing that, if you want to pull out your questionnaire again, we do have some more prompts on this particular topic related to your handbooks. Look through those, and again, think through your school's handbooks, and use this discussion hopefully as an opportunity to assess what needs to be updated, what's missing, are there things that we want to include, are there questions that you have that you want to talk to an attorney about? And that's what this tool is here for. And as you're looking at that, you may be saying, well, Tim, there's a whole nother topic here. We haven't even got to that yet. And that is just a teaser for our bonus coverage. So you be on the lookout, because we're going to continue our conversation after this webinar is over about government funding, public benefit programs as they relate to Christian schools, because that can be a great opportunity for schools. And those programs can also be great opportunities to maximize parents' educational choices for their kids, which is a critical part of all this. So we're going to dig into that a lot, because that's a big topic right now. There's so much going on in the courts right now on that issue. So we're going to dig into that more, and you're going to be able to access that conversation later in a follow-up email that we're going to send you. So stay tuned for that, and you can learn more on that topic as well. But let's just wrap things up here. We've walked through, I think, some of the core issues that every Christian school needs to review. We talked about admissions, we talked about handbooks, hiring policy, athletics. And as you listened to the conversation, took the polls, reviewed the questionnaire, you probably found at least one or two things that you see gaps or you have questions about. And that's to be expected. That's normal. You're not alone in that. That's exactly why we put all of these resources together. That's why we're sitting around this table having this discussion now, because we don't want you to feel like you have to solve these issues on your own. You shouldn't, in fact, try to solve them on your own. Now, it can be easy, I think, for schools to think, because they have so much going on, to say, We've been operating this way for years. We've had these policies for years. We haven't had any trouble yet. We'll be fine. But the truth is, as I think you heard in the discussion, a lot of stuff that Ryan shared, the legal landscape changes fast. And the policies that were in place that protected you 5-10 years ago may not be enough to protect you today. And so that's where we come in. That's where this team comes in. The Alliance Defending Freedom and our Church and Ministry Alliance and our attorneys are here to walk along schools like yours every day to help you strengthen your policies and reduce legal risks that you may have, and ultimately to protect your mission and allow you to fulfill the call that God has on your school. And we don't stop, and you heard this in the discussion, we don't stop just at legal guidance. What we're really about is helping schools disciple the next generation in truth and in love. We want to ensure that you and your staff and your teachers and your students are free to live out the biblical mission they're called for, being a part of that community without fear of government overreach or cultural pressure compromise. And it can be done. But you're probably feeling pressure. It could be from state regulations. It could be from enrollment challenges, financial challenge, just cultural shifts. It can help to know that you're not alone. There's so many other schools in that position. We're talking to them every single day, and you don't have to feel like you're alone. You don't have to navigate on your own. So we want to encourage you to join the Church and Ministry Alliance. If you identified any gap in your policies on any of these issues, we encourage you to join, submit those, and get on the phone with Pat or Val and talk through these issues. Have these conversations related to your school and specifically. If you join the Church and Ministry Alliance, we offer a religious liberty assessment tool that's to review your governing documents and policies. Val mentioned that earlier. And then we also provide a lot of legal updates and resources in real time so you know what's going on. If there's new issues that are arising that you should be aware of, we'll bring those to your attention. We also offer practical guidance through attorney consultation. So if you have ongoing questions, it's not just to sit down and do one review and then it's done. It's an ongoing relationship that we have with you. We walk with you every step of the way so that as issues arise, as questions arise, we're here to serve you. We'd love to support you in the calling that you have. And one thing I just want to note is we have set pricing for this program to make it accessible to every school. It starts at just $500 a year because we want to make we want to make sure that every school has access to the legal support that they need. We're not doing this to make money. That's not what ADF is about. That's not what this program is for. The only reason we charge at all is just to make sure that we have enough attorneys on staff that we can answer questions that come in from every school that has it. So if you're ready to learn more about how ADF can help your school, you can scan the QR code and one of the members of our team will reach out and talk to you further about the details. And you can go to adfchurchalliance.org and sign up there as well. Let's keep working together to protect the freedom of Christian schools, to teach and disciple the next generation boldly, faithfully, and without compromise. Thanks again so much for joining us, and be on the lookout for some of our bonus content and other information about the program. Thanks again. Have a great day.